Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. The Association of Black Employees at Illinois State University, the Department of Social Work at Middle Tennessee State University, and the School of Social Work's DSW program at Spalding University welcome all attendees and our esteemed panelists. Happy Social Work Month. My name is Nikki Jones, and I'm a reparationist and one of your moderators. We've convened this evening to discuss a topic of great importance: advancing reparatory justice in social work, a call to action. Your presence here today reflects your commitment to engaging in meaningful dialogue about reparations. We look forward to a thoughtful and enlightening discussion as we collectively explore the complexities surrounding reparations and their potential impact on fostering a more just society. I would like to introduce our panelists and the moderator this evening. The other moderator this evening. Their longer bios are available at the website SW4, reparations.org. First of all, though, I want to give a thanks and shout out to Angel and Quanisha for helping us with tech support. So we have Dr. David Androff, a professor and associate director for doctoral education in the School of Social Work at Arizona State University. He's an internationally recognized scholar in the areas of human rights, social development, and global social work. We have Councilperson Ja'Cory Arthur, a teacher, musician, and activist from Louisville, Kentucky. He is currently a music and sociology professor at Simmons College of Kentucky, an artist roster member of the Inner City Muslim Action Network, a percussion instructor at the Louisville Academy of Music, and an endorsed artist with Salyers Percussion. We have joining us later, hopefully, the Honorable Dr. Wanda Thomas Bernard, who in November 2016 became the first African Nova Scotian woman to be appointed to the Senate of Canada. Throughout her social work career, Senator Bernard has maintained a deep dedication to social justice and racial justice. We have Dr. Kiana Shamsi Dean, a passionate social entrepreneur, restaurateur, adjunct professor, and author. She wears many hats, balancing them with grace and a vision rooted in community upliftment and empowerment. We have Dr. David Est, a professor emeritus in social work at the University of Calgary, who has contributed to the discipline of African Black Canadian history, Canadian social welfare history, along with pieces focused on contemporary issues confronting the African diaspora in Canada. We have Dr. Kathy McElderry, a professor and chair in the Department of Social Work at Middle Tennessee State University and a licensed certified social worker with more than 25 years of teaching and practice experience. We have Baba J, Dr. Onaje Muid, the co-chair of the National Association of Black Social Workers, National Relations Committee. He's also a lifetime member of the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America. He's an alternate representative on the non-government organization United Nations for International Human Rights Association for American Minorities and co-founder of the NCOBRA Health Commission. Baba J has a long history of creating transformative, liberatory human services theory and practice in the field of behavioral health and in the academy, with social work appointments at Columbia University, Temple University, and New York University. We have Dr. Catherine Van Warmer, a professor emerita of social work at the University of Northern Iowa. She has taught in departments of sociology, social work, and criminal justice at various universities, been involved in 2 civil rights movements in the United States and Northern Ireland, and taught for over 25 years at the University of Northern Iowa. Her scholarship is in the areas of human rights and restorative justice. My co-moderator this evening is Danielle Beasley, who is currently the Associate Director for Diversity, Equity, and Outreach at Illinois State University Student Counseling Services and a first-year doctoral student at Spalding University School of Social Work. Tonight, we'll begin with each panelist providing us their stance on reparatory justice based on their professional and personal experiences. Then we'll have Q&A from the audience who can add their inquiries or thoughts to the chat, and a final wrap-up from each panelist. Now we ask that each panelist provide their status and stance on reparatory justice by answering the following questions in no more than 5 minutes. How do you define reparations in the context of our discussion on advancing reparatory justice in social work? What is the ultimate goal of reparations, and how might it contribute to a more just and equitable society? Or put another way, long-term social and economic justice. Why should social workers and others support reparatory justice, particularly for African Americans? And we'll start with Dr. Androff.
Hi, good afternoon. Welcome everybody to this wonderful symposium. Thanks to the organizers for inviting me and for doing a great job putting together this really exciting panel. And thanks for the really thought-provoking questions. I just want to say, even though we're on a panel and with this symposium for virtual reparations, I want to be clear that we're calling for real reparations. That's the only joke I could think of to get started. But I think of reparations as a tool for advancing social change, and I say it that way because I think it's important to understand that there just could be one tool in a larger toolbox of addressing past human rights violations and advancing social progress. And in some ways, I think they're an imperfect tool. But I think there's a lot of practical benefit. My personal belief is we have to, in order to change the future, we have to face the past. And so that's the context where I think that reparations could be one ingredient in achieving that. My background and perspective on reparations is really rooted in restorative justice and transitional justice, which again include reparations as one part of a larger spectrum of justice interventions or activities that can be used to advance social change, and particularly to rectify and address wrongdoings in the past. So sometimes this can involve formal apologies, truth-telling activities, initiatives around healing, reconciliation, sometimes memorials, museums, and then of course also reparations. And I think, restorative justice is part of this idea that the traditional, legal system doesn't really work towards restoring community after, violence, after violations. And so this idea that we need alternative ways to achieve justice beyond what the current law and the current system allows for. And transitional justice kind of lays out and says, well, we need tools to move from more repressive societies to more open and free and democratic societies. So the focus is on a transition from one society to another society. And in the field of transitional justice, there's been a range of reparations programs that have been used around the world to help different countries move from dictatorships, civil war, and even overcome examples where there's been genocide, slavery, or other injustices, historical injustices. And so I think that's important to normalize reparations and say that they're a very commonly accepted international tool for advancing social progress. I know that part of the conference today we're talking about is reparatory justice, which I think includes some of those other elements, but also includes an extra dimension, which is focusing on the intergenerational impact of racism and colonialism, and trying to seek compensation, recognition, and different types of policy interventions for that. Reparations, I believe, are I said imperfect tool because they're frequently criticized on both sides. There's a lot of opposition against reparations, but even when they are achieved, in a lot of international contexts, they're usually criticized as being, too little, too late, or even in some cases like you're just trying to buy off the victims. So it's not really, I don't see it as this is some magic solution that's going to fix all of our problems, but I do think they're an essential component to addressing a lot of the past human rights violations and building a more sustainable future, a more just future. I think I've been working to try to understand reparations in the social welfare policy context, and I think we can use that framework to understand them, to study them, and to advocate for them. So, applying like basic social work policy 101 type of ideas, the policy class ideas, they're like a targeted or selective intervention, not a universal program. They're more selective, but they're, cash usually in kind versus in kind. The programs, the reparation program will be delivered centrally by the United States, maybe by federal government, and would be financed by like the general revenue. So, the last couple comments I want to make about how I think about reparations and understand reparations is to say, there's been a lot written about the different types, and because there can be a few different dimensions of reparations. There can be individual reparations, such as direct cash payments made to individuals for different criteria, different eligibility criteria. But then there's also a category of collective reparations, which could be, broader policies, social policy, healthcare policy, economic policies that try to invest in human capital, invest in people's health and education or job opportunities, or even build infrastructure in certain communities, such as building schools, hospitals, or expanding services. But then there's also, symbolic reparations, which is what I referenced earlier with museums, memorials, truth-telling activities, and I think that can be important also. So I want to respect the time of my co-panelists. So I think I'm over 5 minutes, so I'll stop so we can move on to the next. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Androff. We'd like to hear from Councilperson Arthur now. You can unmute yourself.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for being here. Thank you to all of our participants who are here with us this evening. So reparations is repair, fixing something that is broken. And I see this in real life every day as a descendant of slavery from my own personal experiences, but also professionally, being able to travel to every major American city in this country, visiting the Black communities and seeing this through line of economic deprivation. I see it in the classrooms that I visit when I'm working with my students. I see it in my family. I see it in my friends. I see it in my own neighborhood. So as we think about reparations, it's important to center the conversation on where we are now, because we didn't magically just get here in terms of our economic position. Black America is twice as nearly, unemployed when it comes to our white counterparts. Our Black families have significantly less wealth, over 40% less wealth compared to white families. Black children are 3 times more likely to live in poverty. The disparities go on and on, whether we're talking about education, home ownership, maternal mortality. These are not new statistics. Where we are today is very intentional, and it is anchored in something that broke us. It is anchored in policy. And because it was anchored in policy, I truly believe that policy is the only way to fix it or to get us out of it. And I'll really second what I just heard from my fellow panelists who talked about selective reparations. We have to make sure that the specific repair is provided for someone who went through a specific harm, a specific person who went through a specific harm. If my house is on fire and someone calls 911, I expect that fire truck to pull up and hose my house down, not hose down the whole block, not hose down my neighbor's house, not offer firefighter services to anyone who decides they want them. We have to be very specific in what we're talking about. Otherwise, it's easy for the conversation to get lost as we talk about repair. When Japanese Americans were offered repair and received repair, they were deserving of that. And they went through a specific atrocity that reparations, direct payments, were used to make whole in some way. The same thing goes for our indigenous people in this country, went through a specific atrocity and were offered and received repair that they were deserving of. Jewish Americans who suffered an atrocity overseas, but were still able to get access to repair through the United States government. They are deserving of that. Black Americans who descend from slavery are deserving of that as well. But for some reason, here we are, centuries after the fact of the institution of slavery, just a few generations removed from the institution of legal segregation, and we are still fighting that fight. So I absolutely wholeheartedly 10 toes down believe in reparative justice on the larger scale being paid by the federal government. And of course, remedies at the state and the local level as well are really important. But we have to be careful as we talk about reparations in our work, social work, compared to a federal reparations program. When you collect city budgets, state budgets, we're looking at roughly $5 trillion. If we were to add up the number of people who were enslaved, inching towards the end of the Civil War, the wages at the time, and multiply that with a very small, modest compound interest rate over time at 3%, we're talking about a $20.9 trillion check that needs to be distributed to descendants of slavery. So we have to talk about the federal government. We probably saw this most recently in 2020 at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, where people were given survival checks. We call them stimulus checks, but they were really just survival checks to keep us trying to survive in that moment. The federal government has the power to do this. We just need to build the people power to make them do it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Councilperson Arthur. Now we'll hear from Dr. Shamsi Dean.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. Thank you to all my panelists. I'm more excited to hear from you all than you all hearing from me, but I'm glad to be a part of the number and to be invited to the table, or the table that we created for ourselves, right? Just to answer the question so I don't take too long, reparations in this context, I believe it extends beyond financial compensation, and it includes systemic reforms that address the root causes of racial disparities. Social work specifically has traditionally focused on treating symptoms rather than advocating for solutions to systemic issues. True reparatory justice in social work means acknowledging the historical and ongoing impact of slavery, Jim Crow laws, and systemic racism. It's about following this formula, right? You have to move from acknowledgement, because a lot of us are struggling to actually just acknowledge and agree, to what actually transpired and the impact of slavery and Jim Crow laws and systemic racism. So once we get to that acknowledgement, then we can get into the atonement, right? Which also includes not just acknowledging, but also repair. And that falls into this space of action, right? So we have to address the why behind the problems as we aim to solve those problems. And the ultimate goal of reparations is to rectify the injustices of that slavery, of the systemic racism, creating a society where the playing field are truly equal and we are in position to have equitable opportunities, because it's two different things, right? This involves not only acknowledging the existence and impact of the historical injustices, but it also atoning for them through actionable measures. Reparations should aim for long-term and social and economic justice. It's beyond a cash payout. It's cash infusion that will revitalize an entire ecosystem for disenfranchised people. These infusions should include and focus on wealth creation systems, such as housing opportunities, because we were impacted by redlining, right? Restoring 296 years of lost wages from free enforceable labor, right? 96 years of segregation, which also impacted what kind of wages we were getting. Access to free education, which we were robbed of at one point. We weren't allowed to be educated. Healthcare and tax incentives. And truly addressing these grand challenges of social work and social justice head on, which is what we're supposed to stand for as social workers, right? And then supporting reparatory justice is fundamental to social work professions committing to social justice and the dignity and worth of every person. A social worker must band together with other social workers to acknowledge that slavery and racism have had a profound impact on African Americans. It's not enough to just treat the systems. We must advocate for systemic solutions that address economic inequality and financial capability for all, which again comes back to those being one of the grand challenges of social work and social justice. We can't just pick and choose which one we want to do because it's more comfortable, right? If we're social workers, we care for the equitable and the equality for everyone. And we cannot just sweep under the rug what that means for those who haven't been impacted by systemic racism and slavery.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We'd like to hear from Dr. S now. You have to unmute, sir.
So thank you. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. I was surprised that I was invited because my work in reparations is a relatively new thing. I just finished a study last year for the Canadian Association of Social Workers. And in Nova Scotia, there's a small chapter of the Association of Black Social Workers. And they asked us to frame our recommendations in the form of reparations. And as part of that study, we read first the American literature on reparations, and I know some of you have contributed articles. And then I did a search for Canadian academic literature on reparations, and there was virtually nothing. There's just nothing that has been written about reparations in the Canadian context. But what I did find was that, and especially in the province of Nova Scotia, which is that has been a long-term home for African Americans at the turn of the end of the War of Independence in 1783, when approximately 3,500 Black loyalists settled in Nova Scotia. So within Nova Scotia, there are a number of community magazines, community newspapers, and within these publications, there are numerous debates regarding reparations. But from a national perspective, I would say that outside of the province of Nova Scotia and perhaps Ontario, that the issue of reparations in the Canadian context is quite limited. Which I'm not surprised, because when I think about the existence of people of African descent in Canada, and when I talk about Canadian Black history, it's virtually not taught in our K-12, and just in the last couple of years that we've had some universities who have developed and offered Black Canadian Studies programs. So when I think of reparations, I think it's Canadian society way of addressing, first of all, the enslavement of African Canadians, because most people are not aware that Canada had over 200 years of enslavement of African Canadians and Indigenous populations here in Canada. But it's just more than addressing the enslavement of African Canadians, because the enslavement of African Canadians facilitated a process that African Canadians have, since the abolition of slavery in 1834, have been recipients of several forms of injustices, including racism and discrimination. And the manifestation of racism and discrimination in the context of Blacks in Canada, this anti-Black racism exists in every sector of Canadian society, whether it be health, education, social services, immigration, child welfare. It's quite explicit. And it just took the death of George Floyd for Canadian society to be awakened of its slumber and begin to recognize the existence, first of all, and the magnitude of anti-Black racism. So I look at reparations, as I said, as a way of addressing enslavement of African Canadians and the subsequent and long history of racial discrimination. And in my view, reparations is a social justice issue. And therefore, it's an important issue because we haven't had the opportunity, like our white Canadian counterparts, to accumulate generational wealth, and therefore African Canadians, comparatively speaking, our wages, their salaries are not even close to our white counterparts. And so I think that it's imperative for the profession of social work to deal with the issue of reparations. And I say ideally because when I look at Canadian social work, the profession of social work in Canada, first of all, and then when I look at Canadian social work education, I've concluded that both of those bodies, and we have professional organizations, historically and even today have contributed to white supremacy in Canadian society. And I say that social work ideally is situated to deal with reparations, but I'm not convinced that social work has the willingness or capability, because all schools and faculties of social work have this social justice as its mission. But when I take a look at how our community has been treated or mistreated, to me, there's a great degree of incongruency and discrepancy. And I'm going to close my remarks because I do believe that as a social worker, that we have a vital role to play in pushing various levels of government and Canadian society in terms of providing people of African descent in this country with reparations. And when I talk about reparations, I'm talking more than just monetary forms of compensation. And so I think the first thing that we need to do is that we need to educate Canadian society to our history of Black people in Canada, because it's virtually most Canadians are not aware of our history, and we've been here longer than the British. We've been here for over 400 years. So we need to educate, as I said, what is reparations and the related issues arising from this topic. But it's just not good enough to educate. I think that we need to take on an active role in contributing to the reparations movement. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. S. We appreciate having the Canadian perspective.
Thank you.
Now we're going to hear from Baba J, Dr. Mueed.
Thank you very much. I'd like to acknowledge the organizers of this panel. I think you have done a tremendous work in terms of bringing us together and being courageous enough to bring this issue forward. I don't think of it, I can't think of any forum like this that has ever happened before. If it has, certainly somebody bring it to my attention. And if it hasn't, you need to be congratulated, all of you, all the work that you've done to think about it and put it together. And I'm truly honored and privileged to be here with my distinguished colleagues. I'll start off by saying that in the spirit of in recognition of Callie House, in the spirit and recognition of Queen Mother Audley Moore, in the spirit of recognition of Mashariki Jawanza. These are three African women who have made major contributions to the reparations movement, and I want to bring them into this space. I want to say also that if there's a crime, there's a criminal. If there's a criminal, there's a victim. If there's a victim, there's a harm. And if there's a harm, it really should be some way of repair. So reparations is this repair. The harm that the National Association of Black Social Work, the National Coalition, National Coalition of Blacks Reparations in America, and COBRA has said is that at least 5 areas, and this is just the beginning. The question, the harm of peoplehood and nationhood of a people that's been damaged. The question of education, and Carter G. Woodson in 1933, the miseducation of the Negro, and we can do a whole lecture just on that alone. Criminal punishment system coming from chattel slavery into convict leasing, into peonage, into whole prison industrial complex, a straight line, uninterrupted straight line. And then, of course, many of our panelists have already talked about wealth and whole connection in terms of poverty. And then since we're talking about unjust enrichment, of people benefiting from the theft from someone else and not acknowledging their crime. There's been a crime that's been committed, and this government doesn't want to admit the criminal that they are. And then, of course, we go with health. We talk about health, we talk about not just physical health of the person or the community, of the family, or the community. We're talking about the social health, the social ecology of the people. And those are just the 5 beginning harm areas that we can look at. If you look at reparations in terms of the international scope, the first thing is you have to stop the harm that's being done. Sensation, then we move into compensation that people talk a lot about, but also restitution. How do you repair people back to the state they was in prior to the harm? And rehabilitation, right? And I think that's where our work is in terms of social workers, psychologists, so forth and so on. And another condition in terms of that of satisfaction. To put it into context, we know in 2001, of which I was a delegate to the United Nations World Conference Against Racism, slavery was declared a crime against humanity. To understand the significance of that, there are 3 major international crimes: genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. So we're saying what has happened, particularly to African people, and also remember, indigenous people was also subjugated to slavery as well as they came out in that conference. We're talking about this massive human crime that hasn't been recognized to the extent that it should, and certainly not compensated. So reparations is not just a United States issue. This is an international issue. Why? Because it's taking place in the context of imperialism. It's taking place in the context of colonialism. It's taking place in the context of domestic colonialism. Lampkin, when he came up with genocide, in the Genocide Convention, one thing that was left out was ethnocide. Ethnocide is the killing of a people. And remember, here in the United States, and when you think about this, how can somebody come up with the phraseology, we must kill the Indian to save the man? I mean, deprivation. I mean, you want to kill the Indian to save the man. So that's the level of deprivation in terms of white supremacy, in terms of their need to subjugate others just so they can feel better than. In conclusion, I'll say that reparations are all these things. And there's probably things that we haven't even thought of because we haven't had the conversation. And the fact that you're opening up the conversation, you're allowing us to, in fact, explore the things that hasn't been said, that haven't been thought about, because all this is a question of negotiation, and it's demand and negotiation, so forth and so on. But if we're going to evolve as a human species, it means that any harm that's been done in any place must be repaired if we're going to create a world that we all can feel safe in. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Baba J. Okay, now we'd like to hear from Dr. Van Wormer.
Is that unmuted? Okay. Well, I grew up in New Orleans, and these were the days of Jim Crow, late 1940s, 1950s. And it was so much taken for granted in society at that time. And I mean, I didn't even think about the injustice until when I was in college. I picked up a book called Black Like Me, and the whole thing, came to me. And that influenced me to get involved in human rights and civil rights. So from there, I want to say I'm really excited about this movement, and I'm optimistic. I took a look on Google and saw what was going on all over the United States. One place and another place, and even Canada. Well, Canada did some wonderful things for the indigenous population, and they had, everything there, the testimony, the witnesses of the way their children were treated in the boarding schools. I see that as a model that I would think would be followed in Canada, and it would be followed in the United States. And I was looking at these small towns. Of course, Tulsa, Oklahoma is on the verge of doing something really big, I hope, for the mass slaughter that took place there. And then there's Evanston on a small scale, Evanston in Illinois, and that has to do with the housing and the injustice there. So for a definition of reparations, this is all about making amends and healing for all people. And I think the people who are on the side of injustice, there's tremendous guilt feelings and almost trauma there. And there's a need to be healing for the whole community and the whole society. The best thing would be at the federal level. I think we'd all see that. And I see some good steps going on there. Cory Booker and, a number of others are very activists, Bernie Sanders and others in Congress. And after the George Floyd killings, there's a momentum like there never has been before. So I see big things happening, and I would like to see social work at the forefront of the movement for reparations. And no other profession is as activist and as radical activist from the left wing side as social work. That's what attracted me as a sociologist to switch over into social work. It's said that social work is a human rights profession. They need to do a lot more there as a starting point. They need to get human rights in the code of ethics. And that's where reparations would fit in very well for the human rights violations that have been done in our history. And thinking of the history, I really think after Reconstruction, the horrible things that went on in the South at that time, that's when you had the lynchings and really a hatred of Black people. They weren't property and they weren't respected. And the Black codes were passed. People were imprisoned, really just to get them to be workers for free labor. So all this exploitation that went on, and in the cotton fields, the only openings for them job-wise were picking cotton or working in domestic service. I'm moving in different directions, but I co-authored a book called The Made Narratives because I was so haunted from my past. And I wanted to hear from the Black women who had worked in the South under Jim Crow. So what I did with two African-American co-authors was get a collection of these narratives. And reading that, I say, they deserve reparations, and there are people who could be witnesses today. I was reading that in the one in, let's see, I wrote down Rosewood, Florida, where they had the reparations. And it was the testimonials that moved a conservative Congress toward giving them the reparations for the massacre that had taken place there in the 1920s. So getting those testimonials, I see, is really important. I'm going to jump down to my recommendations. First of all, restorative justice. It should be.
Oh, Dr. Van Warmer, we're gonna do recommendations once we finish
Oh,
up.
separately? Okay.
Yes,
Okay,
ma'am.
I'll hold off on that.
Thank you.
I see a goal of reparations as saying you're sorry from the point of view of the people who were on the side of the ones who were getting the benefits, right? The economic benefits and so on. And trying to make up for it, making amends. Another goal is public awareness. And this is where the testimonials come in, or the history comes in, and let people know, let the general public know, so that the people in Congress can't overlook it. So basically, yeah, I'll end there and then I'll come back on, I have quite a few recommendations.
Excellent. We look forward to hearing them. Thank you, Dr. Van Wormer. Now we're going to hear from Senator Bernard. Thank you for joining us. We're glad you made it home safely.
Thank you so much for inviting me to join the panel, and apologies for being a bit late, but thankfully, because I was able to join from the car, I heard all of your intros at the beginning, and I've really enjoyed listening to the panelists. I'm grateful that you invited myself and my friend and colleague, Dr. S., so you have two Canadian voices here. Dr. S. already shared with you a lot of the things I think that I would have shared as well. So I'm just going to highlight a few things. When I think about reparations, specifically in social work in Canada, I think about the need for greater awareness, the need for greater analysis, and the need for actions, and also the need for more accountability. And I think we need that across the board. We certainly need it in social work, but we need it in all of our systems because, as has been said by, I think, every panelist so far, the issues that our community members are dealing with run deep and broad across a number of systems. And we're talking about, so many people who are living in deep poverty, who are struggling with everyday racism, who are finding whatever means they can to deal with that. And some of those are positive strategies to cope with the everydayness of racism. Some of them are not so positive. And we know that this is largely due to the multi-generational trauma that our people have experienced. And also, I would say that one of the things that's happened here in Canada is that there's been a collective erasure of our full history, a collective almost amnesia about our history. And we were taught that Canada was the promised land. We were the place that your poor ancestors, the poor African Americans, escaped to use the Underground Railroad. They escaped, or they were refugees, or whatever. They escaped to Canada, and Canada was the promised land. Well, let me tell you, our ancestors arrived here and experienced anything but the promised land. I was appointed to the Senate in 2016. In 2017, I introduced an inquiry into anti-Black racism because I was just witnessing so much racism on Parliament Hill. And I thought, we need to bring public attention to this. From that, I sponsored a bill to have Canada officially recognize Emancipation Day. When the British called for the emancipation of slavery on August 1st, 1834, it was in all of the British colonies. Canada was one of those colonies. But there are still people in Canada that believe slavery didn't really exist here. So that my bill didn't pass, it was actually deliberately stalled. And then we had an election, so the bill died on the order paper. I made a decision at that point. I thought, whoever forms government next, I'm going to push them to move this forward. This needs to be a government bill, not a Senate bill. And I was successful in getting the Trudeau government. They weren't able to make it a bill, but they made it a motion, and that motion was unanimously passed in 2021. Now, it's not lost on any Black person, any African Canadian who knows what's going on. We know that that was largely passed because of the murder of Mr. George Floyd during COVID. The fact that people watched that over and over and over and were traumatized by it over and over and over, there was a rush to action. The thing that frustrates me most about this, so we now recognize Emancipation Day in Canada, but who's taking responsibility to educate? Who's taking responsibility to bring forward reparations? Reparations are about restoring harm. I'm delighted that this conversation is happening. And we're having this conversation about reparations and social work. And the work that we did with the Canadian Association of Social Workers, we're certainly hoping that that work will spread to other professional bodies, other professional organizations. But most importantly, you know, we need government. I heard someone on the panel talked about the need for a national action. We feel the same way in Canada. There's a need for a national action. So that call to action is consistently being called for. And we will call for it until we receive the action. We are seeing some reparations. We're seeing dedicated budget to address Black community issues and needs across the country, but they're afraid to call it reparations. And I believe the reason they're afraid to use the term reparations is because they're afraid we'll ask for more, because they know we're due more. Like, they know that we're owed reparations, but they're trying as best possible to give us enough to keep us quiet. Reality is we're not going to be quiet. You know, that's our reality. We will not be quiet. We will not rest. So and in social work, I believe social work needs to lead the cause. Social work needs to lead this. I see social work as being about social justice. Many people, many social workers see social work as being about social control, and we have a lot of harm. Social workers have caused a lot of harms in our communities, and it's time for social workers, institutions of social work educators and educational institutions need to step up, need to take accountability, and need to bring reparations in where they're needed. It's time for us to truly lead the kind of change we want to see. When the Emancipation Day motion was passed in 2021, there was a petition submitted asking for reparations. The government tabled the petition. A year later, another petition was tabled in our federal government House of Commons. That was tabled. People are running out of steam. We will continue with petitions. We will continue to get thousands of people to call on the government for more reparations because they are needed. We are dealing with issues that run very deep and very broadly across our nation. But it's wonderful to be having this conversation here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Senator Bernard, and to all of our esteemed panelists. I'm so excited to take us into the next space, which is question and answers. And so if anyone in our audience have questions, please let us know. You can use your raised hand feature. You can also use the chat. But I am going to get us started with a question. I've been jotting down so many great things that you all have been talking about. And I've been hearing things like social work is ideally situated, right? And that we should be the front runners of some of this. I've heard about reparations as accountability and the need to repair because there was harm. But Senator Bernard, you talked about something about that there has been this collective erasure of our history, right? And I really want to kind of stick on this for a minute because one of the things that, you know, we've been thinking about is how do we talk about this with current generations, and how do we determine the responsibility of our current generation of social workers for historical injustices that have been done? And I'm very interested to see you all's perspective about that. Would anyone like to lead that question?
Maybe I could start with that, Danielle.
Yeah.
One of the things in my teaching, one of the things that I say to students, and students often carry a lot of guilt. White students carry a lot of guilt around anti-Black racism. So one of the things I always say to them, look, you don't have to feel guilty about being born white. You don't have to feel guilty about being born into race privilege. It is what it is. but what you do with it is what matters. So you're not responsible. Absolutely not. You're not responsible for what's happened in the history, but you are responsible for what you do. And I try to engage people. I try to call people in. I try to invite people in. I try to say to people, look, there's enough work to go around. There's enough for all of us to do here. So think about your sphere of influence. Think about the influence that you can have. What will you do with it? How will you use it? How will you fight? How will you fight for reparations? How will you bring reparations forward? Even using the language of reparations and using the language of anti-Black racism. You know, I have found in social work, people don't want to talk about anti-Black racism. Well, let's talk about racism. Let's talk about everything else. Let's talk about anti-oppression. But there's almost a running away. There's almost a running away from talking about anti-Black racism. I'm at an age in my life now, an age and stage in life where I say, look, I'm unapologetically Black. I went to a segregated school. I was born on Emancipation Day. I'm in a position where I have a voice to use, and I'm going to use it. And I refuse to have it stifled anymore. And social work has tried to stifle that voice as well.
Yeah, I agree with what my good friend and colleague that, you know, like I said earlier, ideally social work should be the vanguard in terms of this reparations movement. But I question if social work is capable and wants to provide the leadership. Now there's a group of us individuals who are very passionate, but we can't carry the load ongoing. And so the profession through social education has to find some way or some mechanism of getting this issue on the radar, so that's talked about and that people become educated. Because I'm currently teaching a social work course at Dalhousie, and the students have asked me to do a class on reparations. They hear about it, but they're not knowledgeable. And as Dr. Bernard said, and that in a Canadian context, I would say that the majority of our faculties and schools of social work don't want to deal with anti-Black racism. They don't want to deal with reparations, and it becomes so it becomes an ongoing battle to get these issues on the radar, and so that faculty members, students, and community members will engage in a meaningful conversation like we are having this evening.
Thank you. Baba J.
Yes, thank you. Erasure, oh my goodness. So as you all know, you look at what's happening in Florida in terms of banning books. It's happening all across the country in different municipalities of this fear of facing the truth. You look at South Africa, you look at Canada, the Truth and Reconciliation commissions that have happened. Well, America doesn't want to, they don't want to hear the truth because the truth will challenge the myth of America that's been so prominent. When I teach, I say, we're going to look at what lines up on the myth of America versus the reality of America. So this country doesn't want to face the reality of what it has done. Collective erasure, oppression wants to do three things, at least three things. It wants to make you ahistorical, it wants to make you apolitical, and it wants to make you afuturistic. And if you can put those three things in place, really the people are are colonized in a very precarious situation. So our work as social worker has to deal with history, right? In social work, we say understanding human behavior in the social environment, but it must be the political environment, the economic environment, the cultural environment, and certainly the historical environment. And once we bring in the historical environment, then we raise these questions of genocide. Then we raise the questions of slavery. When I did my thesis, my master thesis, it was Then I Lost My Spirit, the application of transgenerational historical trauma theory applied to oppress colored nations, to color oppressed nations. And in there, I looked at the text that we were given, right? And if you look at that time anyway, I don't know, I haven't seen it since. I don't think it's changed, but when you look at the definition of reparations, it was so minute, it was like, does it even exist? And because the National Association of Social Workers were members of the International Federation of Social Workers, which is international, right? And having a strong human rights base, it wasn't as if the information wasn't available. So we're looking at a profession that has co-spired with oppression, right? The American Psychological Association did an apology about a year or two ago, right? The National Black Psychologists had a response to that. We need to do the same thing in our field. We need to come up with an indictment of what social work has done, the harm that it has created. So it's not looking outside, right? We need to start to look at inside of what the profession of social work has done. You know, here in the United States, the men, you know, if the women would needed food stamps, if they needed some kind of assistance, the men had to hide in the closet, under the bed. Our families were destroyed. Our family was busted up by social workers. So when you talk about destroying the family, what do you think is going to happen with the children? What's their trajectory? And then you add on top of that, the whole war on drugs. It wasn't a war on drugs. It was a war on people of color. So I think we need to start by looking at our profession itself in terms of what's missing. That's where the erasure is. We can look at the erasure right there.
I appreciate that. That's powerful. Councilman Arthur, and then Matthew Haynes, I see your hand, and then I want to go over to Dr. Jones.
In regards to discussing reparations with today's generations, an example that I like to use is that everybody has to pay taxes, not just for the government services that are currently provided, but also for national debts of the past. And reparations is a debt. Even though Generation Z, Generation Y, or Millennials, Generation X, et cetera, might not be responsible for slavery or segregation, they either benefit from it or are burdened by it. So what do? A social worker is supposed to be a social warrior, a social justice warrior. The issues you face with your clients are likely anchored in some sort of economic deprivation. So for selfish reasons, we could say, well, reparations will make my job a lot easier if I'm not dealing with clients and students that are struggling with economic issues. But beyond social and economic and political justice, we're talking about a moral justice. If you think slavery was morally wrong, we got to put our money where our mouth is. If you think segregation was morally wrong, you have to help us right that wrong. And we also have to understand these conversations are important. Talking is important. Talking is a part of that process. I pray that even after this panel ends, we collectively can talk about how we can use our power and all the people we impact to take action. Because talking don't pay the bills, talking don't feed my kids, talking don't pay that medical debt. We can't just talk about it. We got to work on that direct action and fix it. Our ancestors left a very real and effective and efficient blueprint of using direct action. That means articulating the crisis so loudly and so broadly that whoever the decision maker is, whether it's the President of the United States, Congress, or some other body of government, must act. We saw some of that crisis articulated with the uprisings in 2020, but we got to keep going. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Matthew Haynes.
All right, so I just want to say, all the panelists, you have been absolutely amazing. Everything that you've talked about has been amazing. And I myself am a social work student at MTSU. And one of the classes I've been taking this semester has been cultural diversity. And, through that, it's me, myself coming from a community where race wasn't really talked about a whole lot. My cultural diversity class kind of opened me a little bit more up to certain ideas about race and certain different disparities that are found among certain different races. And through that, I've also been able to just like read literature as well, because we've been encouraged to read literature on specific groups. And I read the Dead Are Rising, which is the autobiography of Malcolm X. And like, even through his reading, it's just like all the things that you talked about is so true. The idea of like that people hear about it, but they're not knowledgeable about it. Like that's so true. And so like that is so true. And like we need to be more knowledgeable about it. I myself as a white man need to be more knowledgeable about it. We as a community, as a people, need to be more knowledgeable about it, because it is not fair for there to be injustice for one particular group whenever we as social workers, our goal is to promote social justice for all people. So just once more, all of you are amazing. And just thank you for letting me be able to speak to all of you.
Thank you, Matthew. We appreciate your comment. Dr. Jones, and then we'll go over to Dr. Shamideen.
Well, I just want to echo something that Councilman Arthur stated, and then speak to social work taking the lead. I agree with everything he said around culpability, and we all have to understand that that's just common practice in the United States, at least, that taxpayers are liable for harms of the government. People are paid reparations every day. And the United States pays reparations every day, and it's paid reparations. They pay reparations to white enslavers when they release folks that were enslaved. They have reneged on different policies and services that could have benefited African Americans, from the Freedmen's Bureau throughout history. I won't narrate it all, but so that's the first thing, that, this is not a question of guilt, but of culpability. And I'm less interested in people's guilt and more interested in what they're willing to do around the culpability and their liability for the harms and the privileges that they continue to appreciate from. That's the first thing. The second thing is social work taking the lead. I would have to clarify that and say, if the lead is I would agree with that if the lead is social work as a profession addressing its own harms. The racial disproportionality and disparity in the child welfare system, the criminal punishment system. There is a long legacy of Brother Garland Jaggers wrote 2 volumes. This brother was one of the founders of NABSW, wrote 2 volumes dictating social workers' harms against African-American communities. Social work in ASW has put out a paper talking about its harms. Where is your truth and reconciliation to address those harms? Social work won't even hardly touch reparations.
Exactly.
And so we want to see social work take the lead in terms of repairing its own harms. That's what leadership looks like to me. I do not want to see the profession, and as someone who considers themselves as an academic reparationist, most of my writings have been in the academic field of reparations. I'm concerned that even though right now social work isn't given a lot of attention, that it will not come in and co-opt, because social work and everybody has all professions, and especially academics, policymakers, often have hidden agendas. And we'll get the grants, right? We'll get the pubs, we'll do the conferences, but it's the masses of people that are really being impacted by these harms. And that's the reality. We often use the masses of people, the issues that affect the masses. We talk about the disproportionality and disparity. Oftentimes it ain't us, the people writing about it, it's our family members and the masses of people. And we use them to get into DEI and other positions. And to me, that's not repair, that's performance. And so we have to be very deliberate about how we touch this issue and where social work enters into this picture, because it doesn't need to be a DEI thing when it comes to reparations. And that's one of the criticisms, that it's going to be that's not going to be the masses of people that really do need those harms that Baba J articulated addressed. And so those are really the 2 points that I wanted to make as it relates to reparations.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. Dr. Shamit Dean.
I just wanted to pull out some keywords that I heard, and you talked about the erasure, right? And I wanted to just dictate this whole thing about this erasure of the truth. And there's a reason why the truth is being erased, in my opinion. And I think it's being erased so that we can lower the accountability that will come with the truth. Because once you know the truth, now you're responsible for doing something about it. So if we remove it, we don't have to do anything about it, right? And I think that actually started to become this thing where they were removing this DEI and can't even say race, can't address anything with race, can't say anything about being Black. Even in some government contracting, they have this government contract process certification that's called 8-8. And the only thing that you needed to do to qualify is to show that you are a disenfranchised individual. And you can literally just say, I'm Black. I'm disenfranchised, so I should have access to this contract. They are now removing that you have to now explain how you're disenfranchised, and Black is not enough, right? So these things are being removed and erased so that you no longer have that access. So if we can't even agree to the truth, how can we get to action? If it's removed, I don't have to act. So it's getting back to this space of now I have to continue to tell you over and over again, this is a problem. Now I have to continue to tell you over and over again, there has been an impact. Now I have to tell you over and over again, slavery has happened and it has impacted me to this level. We can't even get to a place to agree on that. That we have to go backwards. And so once we can finally get there, then we can get to a point to where now you all need to atone. You need to atone, period. And the atonement is going to look like this. But if once we get here, they're pulling us backwards in state by state by state by state, erase, 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 erase. And now we got to start all over. And I think what brought that to life was the situation with California. Because now they have to acknowledge the truth. And they acknowledge the truth, and they put it inside of a paperwork that goes into the government. So now that it's there, you have to acknowledge it. And now that you know to do that, you can't try to put this up in no other country or in no other state. Let's remove you even being able to say that in every other state, i.e. Florida.
I appreciate that. I want to also correct myself on your name, Dr. Shamsid Dean. I apologize for that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Baba J, this will be our last comment before we move to the next question. Thank you.
Yeah, I would like to introduce two, I think, very important contributors to this conversation by way of what they've done. Yusef Clyde, K-A-Y, wrote a book, Antisocial Contract. So all these techniques and different things that's taken place, these strategies, these ways to take us backwards, all this is happening inside the antisocial contract. And what he says is that, yes, there was a written contract, there was a constitution, but that doesn't tell you the whole dynamic or story. In addition to the contract, there's also this antisocial contract. And you can see, when you look at all of the policies and see how you maintain the dominance and exploitation of the people, that's happening through this process that he calls the antisocial contract. I think it's really important for us to read his work and include it in our teaching. And then also I'm going to introduce Jones. Jones says, in terms of oppression, there's always three or four denials. The first denial is that the oppression doesn't exist. The second denial, it wasn't me. The third denial will be that they will create a change, but they will not create a correction. So now you can start discriminating on the consequences of the disabilities and disadvantages that the previous level of oppression has created. So if we look at Clyde and we look at Jones, I think it's going to help us to explain to our students exactly how the mechanism of exploitation continues through the process of domestic colonialism. Thank you.
Thank you. We had a question that came through the chat from Kanisha Carey. What do you feel it would take for the profession to make intentional change when the systems we need to dismantle have the power, money, and white supremacy culture to keep us stagnant? Like We made so much progress with legislation and conversation, and now we see that work being taken apart. We went 2 steps forward and 4 steps backwards, it seems. What are your thoughts about that?
I'll jump in real quick and just say, as an elected official and Floyd get choked out on our phones on the internet. We can't just show up when Breonna Taylor gets killed in, my hometown, the city of Louisville. We can't just show up at the extreme examples of injustice and systemic racism. Because at that point, we're trying to mobilize a people who were already disorganized, or in some cases unorganized, to address that crisis. King used an example of an army mobilizing and demobilizing, how ineffective it would be. You could use the same analogy with a basketball team. They're practicing. If they're not practicing, showing up to that game, they're going to be unprepared. I'm a musician. If the orchestra ain't rehearsing and playing together, jumping on that stage and playing a concert together might be a hot mess. So how are we in between those major crises working together in everyday practice, whether it's reading groups, looking at local legislation, trying to understand it, learn it, analyze it, take a position on it, whether it's community building exercises. How are we in between those major issues that bring everybody out in the streets, mobilizing and organizing ourselves so that we can fight back against some of those larger systems? Because you really just got organized money, wealth class, elite class, ruling class, and then you can have organized people, labor unions, tenant unions, the civil rights movement, issue-based movements. If our people aren't organized as the masses, we will always lose. When we organize, we win. When we fight, we win. The power of the people is stronger than the people in power, but we don't realize that we have power. And when we do realize we have power, sometimes we don't know how to use it the most efficient and effective way. So I just say that from the perspective of somebody who's been organizing in Louisville and who has now crossed into this other threshold of government. People aren't paying attention to what local government is doing until it's too late. We got to stop doing that. We got to get out of that mode. We got to be more proactive instead of just reactive.
Thank you for that, Councilman. Dr. Shamseed Dean.
Piggyback, bravo. I like to just piggyback on you for that. When we're talking about in social work, I want to use, I think we kind of talked about this before everyone came in, where we talked about CSWE, right? Anybody who's in here on the committee, please don't be mad at me for what I'm going to say. Just letting you know. But even in something like CSWE, who is the accreditation board for this, why aren't we advocating for what is it that we want to see? Those who are in here, I would hope that you're in here because this is a topic that you care about, because this is a topic that you want to discuss. This is a topic that you want to be talked about in the masses, right? So I would think that this number alone can be a number that advocates for this conversation to happen within the profession. That's one way of doing it, and making sure that you continue to talk about it over and over and over again. And just like Dr. Bernard was saying, how I'm going to keep coming to the table with this petition. I'm going to keep coming to the table. It's not going to stop. It's the same thing within social work. And social work, that's what we are. We have to get back to what a social worker is. What does social work mean? We can't pick and choose like it's an ATM and take out what we want and not what we need. It is collective. It is everything. Even if it's not your specific profession, if you are a social worker, you care about it all. And if we remember that, if we make sure that we activate ourselves in that, you can support those who may actually have the knowledge to focus on that particular, that specific industry, which may be reparations or whichever. But because you're a social worker, you have to care. So if you care, rally. If you care, advocate. Even if you don't have the knowledge, get behind somebody who does. That's the first way. It's just simple. Just simple.
Thank you for that. Senator Bernard.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to pick up on a point that Councilman Arthur made. He was talking about local government. what I want to say is this. Look, one of the things I've realized in the last 7.5 years since I've been in the Senate, social workers are not very politically engaged, not very politicized. So we need to become more political at every level. I hear you folks have an election coming up. You have fixed term elections. Everyone should be busy working around that upcoming election, but not just during election cycles, right? We need to be doing that engagement all the time. I do a lot of talks with social workers around the country, and no matter what the topic is, I always talk about the need for political engagement at every level. Social workers need to be more political.
I appreciate that. That actually brings me to another question as it relates to the United States specifically and our role within reparations. So what are the challenges and opportunities for reparatory justice in the United States, particularly for Black African Americans, both practically and politically? Yes, Dr. Shamsi.
I'll just say simply enough, I think a lot of our colleagues have said, just being scared of the word reparations. That's one. We don't even want to say it. We're scared of talking about it. Even doing CSWE, just putting it in there, putting my proposal in and saying, let's see how this is gonna go, right? Just the fear of just using the word. But I don't want to be scared to have to redefine or say it in another way that's softer for the palate, right? It's necessary, and reparations is what it is, repair. We need to be able to be comfortable to have that conversation and say that conversation. And if someone is squeamish about it, that's not your shame, that's theirs.
You know, this has come up a couple of times in regards to the word reparations in other people's issue with that. So I want to make sure we hold that and come back to that because I'm interested in unpacking that a little bit. But I see that we have Councilman Arthur and Baba J.
The challenge that we face, I'm talking from the perspective of being a Black American, I can't speak for nobody else but me, is what Dr. Abraham Maslow pointed out, this hierarchy of needs. Your physiological needs are largely unmet. Your safety needs are largely unmet. Belongingness, love, etc. How can you get to the point of self-determination and actualization, which is fighting this fight for reparative justice, when we're dealing with so many foundational issues that are unmet and have us struggling? And I go back to what I said about how our ancestors left us blueprints. We have so much power and potential that we just have not tapped into and used yet. And I think it's a little harder now because, 50, 60, 70 years ago, you ain't have TikTok in your pocket. You ain't have YouTube at the crib. It's a little different. You ain't have the immediate access to so many distractions, which are essentially escapes from this reality that we live in. So I think one of the major challenges would be us not having some of our basic needs met and us having to focus on that and struggle with that before we can get politically engaged. But that's why community is important. If you want to pass a local ordinance, something that we have found out that's essential to build a base of people to pass that work and do that work, you got to feed folks. You got to have childcare. You got to make sure the meetings are, in the evening when folks ain't working. You got to make it accessible for them and help meet some of those physiological needs to make it easier for them to think higher and beyond themselves and think about the collective. So that is a challenge that we face. But again, there are blueprints that have been left behind for us to really have mutual aid and address it right here in this moment so we can get on to bigger fights.
Thank you, Councilman Baba J.
Yes, in terms of the current state and with challenges and opportunities, I was really surprised. I didn't think it would happen when I was teaching at Columbia when the students organized and demanded a decolonized curriculum. I was pleasantly surprised. But I think it points to this question of power, and someone had mentioned it before, in terms of our power is in our numbers, which means we have to organize. So if we look at the trajectory of the profession, we see that there's been, most of the schools don't teach community social work any longer. Everything is moving towards clinical, and of course, that's a neo-colonial prescription to keep oppression in place. So it's really advocating for these larger issues. You know, some people say macro social work. How do we move that forward? I think we need to embrace and go back and take Undoing Racism by the People's Institute of Survival and Beyond, the organization that comes out of New Orleans. I happen to be in New Orleans right now at a conference at the National Association of Black Social Workers Conference. And I was delighted to find out in New York State, because of the organizing that was done on the ground, not only because they have a reparations commission, but I found out today that they were able to change the law, because in New York State, if someone was brought into the child welfare system, the law was that that person would be under supervision up until 18 years of the youngest child. That person would be under supervision until the youngest child that they have became 18 years of age. It's almost like a carryover of slavery. But they were able to reduce that, not only take out the fact that you're going to base it upon the child, they was able to reduce it to 7 years, right? How was that done? If we're talking about reparations, we're talking about getting in touch with the community, knowing that they are our base, and using that power moving forward. And I do think that the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond has been our key teacher in that way, in terms of teaching about what racism is, and it's about organizing. Without that, as the councilman just had mentioned, we'll continue to suffer in the ways that we are. Frederick Douglass said it very clearly. You know, power never succeeded, conceded without a demand, and never did it, never will. It may be a moral struggle, it may be a physical struggle, but it must be a struggle, because where there's no struggle, there is, in fact, no progress.
Thank you, Baba J. Dr. Jones.
Thank you. So in terms of challenges and opportunities, I'm going to start first with our profession. And as far as opportunities, I think because social work aspirationally centers on human rights, social, economic, environmental justice, it provides an opportunity for us to really fold in reparatory justice and model that, as I said, in my opinion, leading that with repairing itself as a profession. And I think that's a big opportunity. Social work can do that through some of the publications, the conferences, things like that, scholarships specific to people of African descent, etc. I think the challenge of social work is very reactionary. Often late to the game, you know, they laggards. It's been very difficult to get just, well, you know, there's always cliques in every profession, and every, you know, group dynamics is always in place. So some people may be able to get some things through, some other people can't, you know. So social work has curated how they want to have a conversation. They are more willing to have a truth and reconciliation conversation. They ain't more willing to have no reparations conversation. For some reason, I don't know if they're connecting the two as a profession. And so I think that's a big challenge that people, our profession is as a profession that's still very aged. And I think reparations has been seen as a joke for so long, or something that's not taken serious, and people are just learning that, hey, things have happened in California, things have happened in Illinois, things are happening in New York. That again, it's going to take something. I don't know what it's going to take, you know, for social work to really latch on and recognize that reparation is here, it's been here, and it ain't going nowhere. Now, in terms of my people, my communities, I think that a strength or an opportunity is that there have been long distance runners in the reparation fight. That this is not a new conversation. This is a conversation that's been had even before Sherman's Special Field Order number 15, where Sherman, when asked the Black ministers, I think it was 20 some odd Black ministers, what would you like post-emancipation? And they say, basically, essentially, the salient points, we want land and we want to realize our right to self-determination, right? Leave us alone. Give us land, let us take care of ourselves and leave us alone. And this has been going on and on and on. You know, Baba J mentioned Callie House and Queen Mother Moore. And there's so many, we could talk about James Foreman, and so many other people that have contributed to this that they have been long distance runners in the reparations movement, all the way contemporarily to now. You have movements that like FBA, like ADOS and others who are contributing to that work as well, contributing to that conversation. This is the problem, the challenge though, that always gets us, my community, jammed up. We ain't got no consensus. We don't recognize that, hey, we can actually be in different lanes going in the same direction. Like, we all want reparations and we can approach the conversation from different lanes, but we still going in the same direction. And that gets us jammed up. This is always getting us jammed up. We don't know how to utilize operational unity. Other groups do it every day. You know, and that is a harm. That's a harm. There are people who did that on purpose to make you believe that you're not yourself, that stopped you from having that type of unity so that you can get what you want. And so that right there, my community, that's the biggest threat. And to me, until we get our stuff together as a community, I think we're going to continue to, it doesn't matter what social work does. It doesn't matter what's going to come through the federal government. If we can't get our stuff together, and I don't know what the Canadian experience is like, but right here in these United States, we can't even come together and have a conversation about how we can realize reparations. Like, can we all get on board? And I do think that the conversation is being had by the same people, like an echo chamber, but what do the masses want? And when I go to my family members, I can say this at least. They saying exactly what Councilperson Arthur said. Ain't nobody studying reparations because they trying to figure out, okay, I'm trying to feed myself. I'm trying to be able to get back and forth to work and pay these bills. And so social work has an opportunity there to get into the community and say, okay, how can we both do this, walk and chew gum at the same time? Get some of these case managers and other people in and have that conversation, how we can do both. And the people that are working in the community, like myself, like Councilperson Arthur, like Senator Bernard, can be facilitators of that process and support that from the ground up. That's the opportunity to me.
Perfect, thank you. I almost don't want to move from that spot, but in the interest of time, I do have to move us along. But I feel like it's just been so much richness that has come through. Dr. Jones, you talked about how NASW social workers are, as a profession, we are ready for truth and reconciliation as a conversation. And Dr. Shamsi Dean, you talked about how we are almost scared, right, to use the word reparations. Like, we often shy away from that. And I'm wondering how
you got cut off.
Reparations.
We didn't hear you, Danielle.
Sorry. I'm so sorry. Am I back? Man, I was doing my great Baptist preaching too. No, I'm just teasing. So I am interested with all of what Dr. Jones and Dr. Shamsi Dean talked about. How can we build public education, support, and awareness for reparations? And what role does education and public discourse play in shaping perceptions of reparations?
Well, I think in the Canadian context that we've got to expand the the public discourse, because as I mentioned earlier that, and this is just my perception, that the issue of reparations in a Canadian context seems to be limited to definitely Nova Scotia and maybe Ontario. From Western Canada, and that includes Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and British Columbia, the issue of reparations is not it's not even close to being on the radar. It's just there's just no discussion. And so somehow, some ways we've got to come up with mechanisms to get this issue talked about from a national perspective, rather than having, like I said, pockets in terms of Nova Scotia and Ontario. Even in the province of Quebec, where I lived for many years and have family members, that the issue is just, it's just not, it's not perceived to be an important issue. And I think there are a lot of reasons for that, but we need to keep on pushing and do whatever we can to make sure that people are aware of the issue, first of all, that awareness, but it's more than just awareness, that there has to be action that accompanies the awareness, because I saw this in faculties and schools of social work after George Floyd got murdered, that various schools and faculties of social work in this country, some of them, on their websites wrote anti-Black racism commentary. So that was in 2020. And I look at 2024, and I would say that the majority of our schools and faculties have done nothing in substance in relation to the issue that we're talking about and other issues such as anti-Black racism. It's just like the people who are in charge or have the power just dismiss it. It's not important to them.
Thank you for that. We will go to Baba J, then Senator Bernard, and then we will end with Dr. Shamsi-Dean. Thank you.
Is this the time for recommendations, or we're gonna do that later?
That will be coming up in a couple moments.
Okay. To answer in terms of what possibilities we could do, it's kind of like reparations. I mean, recommendations in that I think the larger umbrella paradigm that will help all of these arguments and these different demands is, how do we move the profession to become a human rights centered profession? I think that's going to be the biggest bang for the buck, you know. And there's been already some movement, right? One of the education organizations looked at it, and they have now gone to, it should have been included, I think, in this year in terms of standards, right? The whole human rights standards. So if we all concentrate on how do we make the profession a basic human rights profession, that's going to give us the fluidity, I think, to have these larger conversations.
Thank you, Senator Bernard.
Thank you. I think African American colleagues on the call, I think you could learn something from what we've done in Canada. So I'm going to just very briefly tell you what we did. The Association of Black Social Workers reached out to the National Association, the Canadian Association of Social Workers, and basically said, you need to do this. And we pushed them into it, and they agreed. And then we contracted Dr. Est and another colleague to do the work. They accepted every recommendation, every reparation, and they are implementing them. Yeah. In addition to that, after about 20 years of no action on the Code of Ethics, they've just released a new Code of Ethics, And it's a social justice and human rights lens is embedded in the code of ethics now. That's huge. That's really huge. And these things are really connected. That wasn't what I was planning to say when I have my hand up. When I put my hand up, I wanted to also share with you an action that I've taken federally. I reached out to a national organization called the National Museum of History. And I basically said to them, I invited them to do a multi-year plan to do education and awareness around reparations. And they've agreed. They've agreed to do this. And so the conversation started about a year ago. And we've been having ongoing conversations around it, but they have agreed. And so for me, it was being bold enough, courageous enough to ask the question, to put forward the proposal. And each of those examples, that's exactly what we did. And the outcomes are positive in terms of actions, people who are in positions of power and influence, taking the actions based on the recommendations that we push forward and holding them accountable for doing the jobs they're supposed to be doing anyway.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, she said what I was going to say. That's what we need to be. She did. She laid it out. That's exactly what I wanted to say is that let's just look at how many people are in this room right now. There are 53 people in this room, 53 participants. And back to what you said, Dr. Jones, one of our issues is organizing. So if these 53 in here could agree that something needs to be done within our field of social work, then we can organize to take action because we're already on the same page of what needs to be done. And then we can implement all of the things that Senator Bernard said, right? We can start with NCN, we can start with NASW, we can start with CSWE, who is accredited in these courses. We can mandate that there are courses embedded in the social work profession that is addressing not just reparations, but why reparation is necessary. So we're talking about it, it's embedded in us, and we're creating social work, the profession, to be a human rights profession, which encompasses everything that has to do with human rights, including the mental health piece. It can't just be centered on clinical. There's so much more to what social work is. So I just wanted to piggyback. She said it, I don't have to say it, but the biggest piece is organizing and agreeing to start advocating for that implementation.
So we have definitely been moving into our charge forward. So I'm excited to kind of close us out in that way. And I would like to offer to our panelists, if you would give us a very brief recommendation for social workers who want to take real actions to advance reparatory justice, what would you give us as a charge forward? And we can start with Councilman Arthur, if that's okay.
So I'm a member of the American Descendants of Slavery Foundation. We have a National Reparations Summit coming up in October in New Orleans. We invite all reparations organizations, advocates, allies, and everyone in between to join us. If you can't come to the conference, we can stream it. If you can't stream it for whatever reason, you can donate. If you can't donate, you can share about it. You can learn more about our organization and the conference at adosfoundation.org. And I also just echo what I said earlier, that I hope we as a panel can come together and work on something. And of course, follow up with everyone who participated tonight in that action. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Dr. Androff.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for really rich dialogue. Been taking notes and learning a lot. And just want to reflect as we think about recommendations that I think we're really, as I see it, talking about maybe two different related, equally valuable conversations and potential realms of action. One within the profession of social work, what we want to do, how we want to see the profession, and then secondly, what about social work's contribution to the larger national movement or national platform? And so I really want to echo the comments that panelists were making about pushing social work to really live out its ideals, its ethics, and just want to re-emphasize like some of you were mentioning, there are other examples of social work being held accountable and holding itself accountable. So I would encourage everybody to look to some of these examples, particularly in South Africa after the end of apartheid. Social work had a very in-depth reckoning with its history of active participation, really extreme participation in racial discrimination under apartheid, where as an agent of social control, the social work profession was extremely discriminatory. And they took a look at that, and in transparency, they published, the different amounts of even welfare cash payments that they would pay to white families, mixed race families, and then Black families. And there's just huge disparities in trying to acknowledge their role in perpetuating, social problems there. And then also the universities said, publish their rates of admissions to say, this is the admission rate we had for white students. This is, the very much lower rate of admission for Black students to schools of social work. And schools of social work and the social work associations made those, statements and disclosures. In part, they were internationally, they were like blackballed. We were not allowed to participate in international social work organizations through the 80s and early 90s. And then there's some other examples. I think Canada's made some positive steps in making apologies. Also in Australia, the National Social Work Association has made apologies. And we could critique those and say, well, maybe, apologies not really enough. Maybe it's just a good first step. But I think there's examples we can learn from. And I think that would help us to solidify our social work contribution to the larger movement in the country around trying to normalize this discussion, trying to popularize the concept of reparations. And, I would like to say again that I think, it doesn't have to be some magical, scary thing. This is a government, we could frame it as like a government cash transfer, which is, as many of you said, happens every day for multiple groups of people for different reasons. And I love the simplicity that we were offering around reparations is repair. And I agree that's the rationale and the reason. But I also think we could frame it as, reparations as investment, as a cash stimulus, like this idea of the stimulus payments, the survival payments. This is an investment in people and people's well-being and their social welfare in the future. And sometimes that language is really powerful in the policy circles, and maybe there's trouble with that because it's return on investment, now everything is this capitalist neoliberal calculation. But like some of our audience was saying, this is the system we live in, so how can we make the most of it while we're here, and also including the non-economic aspects of systemic reform that some of you mentioned also. So I'm just really inspired by everybody. And I think it's important that we stay hopeful. The last thing I want to say is a challenge I've faced in teaching about reparations to students is a real deep pessimism among people who even kind of refuse to engage because they believe this won't ever happen. And I think the more we can try to build power, definitely echo all the organizing comments, community practice, macro practice, the more we can, get people convinced and believe that change is possible. So, thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Van Warmer.
Yeah, well, I'm really excited about this group and the things that are happening. And I'm optimistic that in the next few years, CSWE standards will include reparations. And I'd almost bet on that. And it's because of the work and publications of authors such as Nikki Jones. I see all these articles coming out on reparations, and I think the time is now. Yeah, human rights is one place to begin. It should be easy to get that included in the NASW Code of Ethics. All the European codes of ethics have human rights there. I want to mention the 13th Amendment because we actually have virtual slavery today because of the statement in there about involuntary servitude. that there should be no involuntary servitude except for conviction of a crime. So we have all these people performing labor like in Louisiana, Angola prison for nothing by force. Other things I want to mention is the Encyclopedia of Social Work. I was told there will be an entry coming out on reparations. Is that true? Is anybody here writing one? Okay, because it's not there now, except I did one on restorative justice and I included reparations, but we need, it to be there by itself. The other one is Social Work Speaks. Need to get a policy statement in there. And so there's a whole lot that can be done. CSWE, their new standards are very radical, and all the way through it's anti-racist practice and anti-oppressive practice. I see big things happening within social work, and at the national level, it'll take some time, but we can organize. And I see social workers doing that community by community and with our people in Congress.
Thank you. Dr. S.
So for me, there's two pragmatic steps that I'm going to take. And the first one is that, as I mentioned earlier, that I'm teaching an undergraduate class of all Black students at Dr. Bernard's former School of Social Work at Dalhousie University. And they've asked me to do a couple lectures on reparations. So I'm in the midst of this weekend, I'm going to put that together. And the second opportunity is related to the School of Social Work, where I taught for 28 and a half years, the Faculty of Social Work at the University of Calgary. Because I think our faculty is ready to begin a dialogue in relation to reparations. And the reason why I say that is that after the murder of George Floyd, there were a group of my faculty colleagues and myself, and we spent a year and we developed an anti-Black racism action plan. It took us a year to do it, but we did it, and it was approved by the faculty, and they've actually moved on some of the things that we have recommended. But it's a work in progress. So for me, the opportunity to spread the word, educate, as well as learn from these students that I'm engaged with, as well as my colleagues. So to me, that's one way that I think I could help social workers push this agenda along at the local level. So that's what I intend to do.
Thank you so much. Bubba J.
Thank you. The scope of the problem might be understood in terms of an ontological rupture. That's what's happened to people who have gone through slavery. Internally, we need to say what positions are we attempting to capture, so people can be in positions they can make those decisions. I think we can use community participatory research that's actually connected with the people, and it'll make that connection and allow them to say what they want to know rather than what we think they should know. I think we can lift up critical evaluation so that now we can include reparations in how we teach that. And certainly I think we need to look at the epigenetics, and I put in COBRA's harm report for those of you who want to look at the harm report about 2 years ago. I think we can use things like psychodrama, right, in our work, where we can start to do the healing. We don't have to wait till reparations happens before we can start the healing process. My dissertation was actually looking at psychodrama in terms of how do we arrest internalized oppression. And then, of course, the power is with the people, as they say. We have to reintroduce the work of the Black Panthers. The WIC program came from the Panthers. The Brackers program came from the Panthers. We have to reintroduce those struggles. We have to reintroduce people like Mutulu Shakur, who created acupuncture, the 5 auricular points, right? We have to bring these examples up of what people have been doing in terms of resistance. We have to partner with the Association of Black psychologists, because they are very strong in terms of moving things forward, and any other group, right? And then lastly, I think we need to also connect with the International Federation of Social Workers, who have shown a very strong human rights approach to how they are, advocating for social work and doing those things simultaneously, and all of us taking a little part that we can play. With that, I'm complete. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Bernard.
Thank you. I echo that statement. We can all be doing something. And I think that's where we should start, is really looking around our sphere of influence. What can we do? So for the students on this call, I would say that, one of the things you can do is really look at how you can bring issues of reparations forward in some of your work. For those of you who are academics on the call, how can you be teaching more? How can we build reparations into more of our teaching, as Dave was suggesting he's doing with the class? In our communities, how can we bring forward reparations more in our communities? I know one of the things that I do is constantly having the conversation, constantly raising the issues, constantly inviting people into dialogue. And this evening has been fantastic. So doing more conversations like this one. And I know you were recording this. I don't know what your intention is for the recording, but if you're able to share it with the 2 Canadians on the call, we could share it with other Canadians. And I think that would be a really good action for us. Thank you.
Thank you. And can we hear from you, Dr. Shamsi-Dean?
Of course. I want to do something a little different in closing. I want us to really just imagine reverse reparations, right? Picture a scenario where every individual of European descent who has benefited directly or indirectly from slavery, structural, institutional, systemic, now experiencing a reversal. The accumulated wealth, resources, and privileges or access built on centuries of inequality are revoked. And then imagine trillions of dollars gained through easy access to housing, education, business loans, and inheritances being stripped away. And then this wealth amassed at the expense of Black communities who have endured poverty, segregation, inequality, access to resources is now reallocated to level the playing field. In that scenario, where would your advocacy be? I want us to think about that. And this is not a visualization that is about advocating for the stripping away of others' gains, but it's about challenging us to confront the realities of systemic injustice and the urgent need for reparatory action. That's my charge.
You don't have to steal my closing like that. I love you for it. Love you for it. I love you for it. This has just been an amazing evening. I have taken copious notes. I'm very excited about the information that was shared, the dialogue that was exchanged, and the charge forward. On behalf of Spalding University's School of Social Work, Middle Tennessee State University Department of Social Work at Illinois State University's Association of Black Employees, we thank you for being here. To our esteemed panelists, thank you so much for your invaluable insight and just the nuggets that you have dropped on us this evening. And I would be remiss if I did not share that this is the brainchild of Dr. Jones, who is a phenomenal professor, scholar, and all of those great things. This is her baby come to life. And so we really appreciate their work towards reparatory justice and for making this happen. We bid y'all a good night, but I really want you to take to heart what Dr. Shamsi Dean had us envision, because the transatlantic slave trade might have ended, but white supremacy and Black inhumanity is still very present in here. And so we need to be able to push forward for reparatory justice, specifically for Black and African American folks, both here in the US and internationally. So we bid you all a good night. Thank you for spending your evening with us, and we look forward to having some form of community and fellowship with you all again. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.